G'day, this is a second video about GraphSchema, the tool for managing graph database schemas, and in particular for being able to spin up GraphQL endpoints on top of a Dgraph database backend. So last time we had a really simple schema about authors and posts, and we were able to do some mutations and then do some really simple queries on top of those mutations. So this time I've just beefed up the schema slightly. So we've got the same types, authors and posts. I've removed the IDs because GraphSchema, you don't need the IDs. It inserts them automatically, so you can have them or not, doesn't matter. It's got the same input types and the same mutations. What I've added is a couple of extra queries. So I've got an author query. So we had one author query before that just given an ID gave us back one author. And now we've got query author that takes a string and gives us back a whole list of authors. Now there's some magic here that's worth explaining about how GraphSchema works. Basically the way it works at this level, although it doesn't have to, is it's about conventions. So when it sees, so there's not a lot of conventions around for GraphQL, it's pretty free form, but there are some conventions sometimes, like having types and then input types that correspond to them. And GraphSchema just gets a little bit opinionated about those things and uses those conventions to spin stuff up automatically. So for example, when it sees a type called author, and then another type called author input, and then a mutation that takes an author input, it strings all those things together and says, hey, this is the real type. This one here is what we're going to use for mutations, and that's what I'm going to expect in there. And then when it sees a get author query as well, it says, oh, okay, well, I understand now that this ID had better be one of the IDs of the author type, and I'm going to expect to get from Dgraph after I run my query something that I can match up as an author in before I return it to the user. And so that's how it's going to string together all of these things just based on convention to be able to run a query against the Dgraph backend and get back a type that looks like the author type. And similarly, when it sees something that's like query author, it's going to expect a string in here, and that string is essentially going to let us do arbitrary Dgraph queries. So there's also a couple of extra annotations that have happened down here in the file. So we'll start with these ones first. So these ones are Dgraph mutations that allow us to add indexes on the types in the schema. So here we're saying the author's name can have a hash index, the post's title can have a term index, and the post text can have a full text index. So that allows us to use Dgraph indexes on our GraphQL types, which then allows us to query them more effectively. So then we'll be able to use all of the Dgraph query functionality in our GraphQL query. So we can now do, for example, text and term searches over posts and authors and hash searches and things, which are the natural Dgraph query properties. So that's how this is going to end up being a Dgraph query. The other thing that's happened here is this line here. So I did change one more thing in the author type, is that I said, well, authors, we really should be able to get from an author to the list of all the posts that they've made, as well as being able to go from a post back to the author. The problem with GraphQL is, if I write this, if I say an author has a list of posts and a post has a link back to an author, there's nothing that says that those two are the same thing. And that's one of the things that GraphSchema allows you to add, is we add another annotation down here that tells us, well, these two things are inverses of each other. So what GraphSchema then is going to expect is, as it spins this up and as it accepts mutations, it's going to make sure that it can match these things up again, so that an author, we can get to all the posts of that author, and from a post we can get back to the actual author of the post, and that those things will always match up properly. So let's see how, there's a couple of other things in here, but we'll leave those for another video. So let's see those working in our Chrome extension. So here's a query. So to get posts, so remember we put a term index on the title, so we can then use Dgraph's term search on the title of the post. So this will then be a query over the post. Instead of just getting one post or all posts, it's going to use Dgraph search to restrict that to only the posts that have the terms or have either term GraphQL and Dgraph in the title. So that'll get us these posts, which are the two posts we added before. We could do a different search though, because we also had a text index on the text field. We could do a Dgraph search for posts whose text has all of this text. So we run that query and it gets us just the one post that has both GraphQL and schema in the text. So that's how we can open up, using just conventions, we can open up GraphSchema to allow not only simple mutations and queries through GraphQL back down to a Dgraph database and back up again, but we can expose the whole of the Dgraph search power as well. So there's the next feature of GraphSchema, is that we get the entire Dgraph search infrastructure as well as GraphQL. So you've now got GraphQL and all of the really good Dgraph searching for free without any coding. You just need a schema. And the other thing we saw in our schema was that we added that from authors you can get to all of their posts, as well as being able to get from a post to the author. So from here we went from the post to the author, but now we can also go the other way around. So because GraphSchema can stitch together that the authors and the posts have got this linking relationship, we can go and get an author based on its ID, find its name, and then follow its posts link to all of its posts. So we run that and we get all of Frank's posts, which are the couple of posts we've added. So now we can do GraphQL, Dgraph queries, Dgraph search, and being able to specify extra metadata about the links in the graph that GraphSchema can then do some extra operations on. Next time I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other ways we can do search in this as well.